White officer spits on black man, then learns he's the new police chief. The sticky August heat clung to Richard Nelson's skin as he stepped out of his car in the precinct's crowded parking lot. His plaid shirt was slightly wrinkled, his jeans worn at the knees, and his sneakers scuffed, a calculated effort to blend in. The new police chief of Blue Ridge, a small town nestled in North Carolina's rolling hills, didn't want his arrival fanfare. He wanted to see the precinct for what it truly was, not through the polished veneer of rehearsed introductions. Richard adjusted his baseball cap, his sharp eyes scanning the bustling lot. Officers laughed and chatted in small groups, glancing at him briefly before dismissing him as just another civilian. He moved with purpose, stepping through the precinct's side door into the hum of ringing phones, murmured conversations, and the faint aroma of stale coffee. "Hey, you!" a voice barked, slicing through the din. Richard turned, his jaw tightening as a white officer strode toward him, a sneer pulling at his lips. "This ain't a shelter. Get out of here!" The man's condescension dripped like venom, his words drawing snickers from nearby officers. Before Richard could respond, the officer's face twisted into something uglier. He spat. Warm saliva struck Richard's cheek, but his resolve remained unshaken. He wiped it away with slow deliberation, his calm words cutting through the laughter. "Is this how you treat everyone who walks through these doors?" Richard Nelson had spent over 2 decades in law enforcement, rising steadily through the ranks with a blend of unshakable determination and principled leadership. As a black man in a field where systemic bias often loomed large, Richard's career had not been without its challenges. He'd faced his share of sideways glances and murmured doubts, but his results always spoke louder. Known for his keen analytical mind and an unwavering commitment to justice, Richard earned a reputation as the officer who got things done the right way. His promotion to chief of police in Blue Ridge was both a milestone and a test. Blue Ridge wasn't just another sleepy southern town. The department had long been shadowed by whispers of misconduct and internal corruption. To Richard, taking the job wasn't about prestige. It was about making a difference in a place that desperately needed it. He'd spent nights poring over reports, noting the patterns of complaints that went unanswered, the repeated names in misconduct files, and the growing distrust from the community. Richard's personal life mirrored his professional resilience. Widowed 5 years earlier, he'd raised his teenage daughter, Maya, with the same determination he brought to his work. Maya, now 16, was his anchor, a reminder of why he'd chosen a career rooted in the belief that justice and fairness were worth fighting for. They shared quiet evenings at home, her laughter filling the spaces his wife's absence had left behind. His daily routine had always been a mix of discipline and compassion. Mornings started with strong coffee and a brisk run to clear his head. He believed in staying sharp, physically and mentally. Yet walking into the Blue Ridge precinct undercover was a stark departure from his typical approach. It was a gamble, one that required him to shed the authority of his badge and blend into the background. This method wasn't about theatrics, it was about truth. Richard wanted to witness the culture he'd heard so much about, raw and unvarnished. As he crossed the precinct's threshold, Richard knew he was stepping into a lion's den. His heartbeat was steady, his resolve firm. He was prepared for hostility but hoped for signs of change. What he found instead was a toxic camaraderie built on exclusion and prejudice. The incident with Officer Daniels confirmed his fears and sharpened his purpose. Richard's mission wasn't just about reforming a department, it was about restoring faith in the badge, leadership, and the possibility that dignity and respect could prevail in a broken system. For Richard, the stakes were personal, the path uncertain, but the goal was clear: to dismantle the culture of contempt and rebuild something better. The precinct was alive with its usual chaos: ringing phones, the hum of conversations, and the occasional burst of laughter. Richard Nelson, still clad in his unassuming plaid shirt and jeans, navigated the corridors with deliberate purpose. He paused near the break room, observing clusters of officers immersed in their routines. No one looked twice at him. He was invisible, exactly as planned. He had barely been in the building for 10 minutes when a voice cut sharply through the din. "Hey, you!" It was loud enough to draw glances from nearby desks. Richard turned to face a man striding toward him with an air of authority. The officer was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore a perpetual smirk that hinted at misplaced confidence. His badge read, "Daniels. You lost or something?" Daniels asked, the corners of his mouth twitching upward. His tone was laced with condescension, and his words hung in the air, drawing the attention of others nearby. Richard held his ground, his calm gaze meeting Daniels. "Just passing through," Richard replied, his voice measured. He didn't elaborate. Daniels stepped closer, his smirk widening as he looked Richard up and down. "Passing through, huh? You don't belong here. This ain't a public park, you know. You're not welcome." His words were louder now, designed to entertain his growing audience. A few officers chuckled, leaning back in their chairs to watch the scene unfold. Richard remained silent, refusing to be baited. His stoicism only seemed to irritate Daniels, who stepped even closer, invading his personal space. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" Daniels sneered. And then, without warning, it happened. Daniels leaned in, and before Richard could react, he felt the warm sting of saliva hitting his cheek. Time seemed to slow. The room filled with muffled laughter and scattered murmurs, but all Richard could hear was the pounding of his heartbeat in his ears. His fingers clenched into fists at his sides, but his expression remained impassive. "That's enough," Richard said, his voice calm but firm. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a handkerchief, wiping his cheek with slow, deliberate movements. His eyes locked onto Daniels, unflinching. "Is this how you treat everyone who walks through these doors?" Daniel's smug grin faltered, just for a moment, before returning. "Only the ones who don't belong here," he replied, loud enough for everyone to hear. The room erupted in laughter again, the sound grating against Richard's composure. Richard said nothing more. He turned and walked away, leaving Daniels basking in his fleeting triumph. But the interaction had already set the tone for what was to come. Richard made his way toward the main office, where Captain Harris was waiting. The older man looked up from his desk as Richard entered, a puzzled expression crossing his face. "Chief Nelson?" Harris stood, extending a hand. "I wasn't expecting you so soon. I wanted to get a sense of the place before the introductions," Richard replied, shaking his hand. His tone was cordial, but his expression betrayed none of the turmoil from earlier. "I've already had an enlightening experience." Harris frowned. "I hope it wasn't too discouraging. This precinct has its issues, but there are good people here too." "I'm sure there are," Richard said evenly. "Let's head to the briefing room. I think it's time we set the record straight." The intercom crackled to life moments later, summoning all personnel to the briefing room. The officers filtered in, some carrying coffee mugs, others with notebooks in hand. The atmosphere was light, filled with idle chatter and inside jokes. Daniels leaned casually against the wall, still grinning from his earlier encounter. He hadn't recognized Richard then, and he certainly wasn't expecting what was about to unfold. Captain Harris called the room to order, his booming voice silencing the crowd. "All right, everyone, settle down. We've got an important introduction to make today." The officers shifted in their seats, curiosity sparking in their expressions. Harris continued. "As you all know, Chief Caldwell retired last month. Today, we're welcoming his replacement, a man with an impressive record and a clear vision for this department. Please join me in welcoming Chief Richard Nelson." The room fell into stunned silence as Richard stepped forward. The light-hearted atmosphere evaporated, replaced by a tension so thick it was almost tangible. Richard's measured steps carried him to the podium, where he set down a folder bearing the precinct's official seal. He let the silence linger, his gaze sweeping the room. Daniel's grin froze, then slowly faded as realization dawned. His face turned a deep shade of red, his bravado dissolving under Richard's steady gaze. "Good morning," Richard began, his voice calm but commanding. "My name is Richard Nelson, and as of today, I am your new chief of police." The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. Richard continued. "When I arrived this morning, I chose to come in plain clothes. I wanted to see this department through an unfiltered lens. What I witnessed was eye-opening. A murmur rippled through the room, but Richard raised a hand to silence it. In my brief time here, I have already encountered behaviors that are not only unprofessional but deeply troubling. Let me make one thing clear: the culture that has been allowed to thrive here ends today. The officers sat motionless, the reality of the moment sinking in. Richard's eyes settled on Daniels, holding his gaze for a moment longer than necessary before addressing the room again. Respect is not optional. It is the foundation of what we do as law enforcement. Without it, we fail, not just each other, but the community we are sworn to serve. He stepped back from the podium, his voice sharpening. Officer Daniels, he said, his tone cutting through the silence like a blade. Daniels flinched, his earlier confidence reduced to a flicker of defiance. What you did this morning was not just an insult to me, but to the badge, the oath we take, and the people we serve. Effective immediately, you are suspended pending an internal investigation. Gasps rippled through the room. Daniels opened his mouth to protest, but Richard cut him off. This is not up for debate. If you think this is a slap on the wrist, think again. This is the first step in a much-needed reckoning. Richard's gaze swept the room one last time. Change isn't easy. But if you're not willing to rise to the standards we are setting, this isn't the place for you. For those of you ready to do better, to be better, we will move forward together. But know this: I will hold you accountable every step of the way. The room was silent as the officers absorbed his words. Richard's presence was magnetic, his authority unquestionable. Daniels slunk out of the room, his face a mixture of anger and humiliation. The rest of the officers exchanged uneasy glances, the reality of their new leader settling in. For Richard, this was only the beginning of a long battle, but he was ready to fight it, not for himself, but for the integrity of the badge and the community it served. Richard Nelson's first day as chief of police in Blue Ridge had sent shockwaves through the precinct. The fallout from Officer Daniels' suspension rippled outward, leaving a trail of uneasy murmurs and side glances. Richard's decisive actions had made one thing abundantly clear: the era of impunity was over. But he also knew this was just the opening salvo in a battle that would be as protracted as it was personal. By the next morning, the precinct's atmosphere had shifted. Conversations in the hallways were hushed, laughter muted. Officers who had once greeted Daniels with camaraderie now avoided him, their alliances shaken by the chief's unflinching display of authority. Daniels' desk sat conspicuously empty, a physical reminder of the change Richard was determined to bring. Richard spent his second day poring over personnel files in his modest office. Stacks of reports and disciplinary records painted a damning picture of the department's internal culture. Complaints of excessive force, discriminatory behavior, and misuse of authority were all too common, often dismissed with little more than a slap on the wrist. Patterns emerged, and familiar names surfaced repeatedly, including Daniels. Captain Harris entered, carrying an additional folder. "Chief," he said, placing it on the desk. "This is everything we've got on Daniels. It's extensive." Richard flipped through the pages, his jaw tightening. The records corroborated what he'd already suspected. Daniels' behavior wasn't an isolated incident, but a symptom of a larger problem. "Thank you, Captain. We'll need to address this in tomorrow's strategy meeting." Harris hesitated. "Chief, if I may, not everyone here is going to be on board with this kind of shake-up. Some of the older officers, they're set in their ways." Richard nodded. "Change is uncomfortable. That's why it's necessary." As Harris left, Richard leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He wasn't naive. Resistance was inevitable. But the depth of the department's issues weighed on him more heavily than he'd anticipated. This wasn't just about firing bad cops. It was about dismantling an entrenched culture and rebuilding trust, both within the precinct and with the community. The next morning, the precinct's first departmental strategy meeting under Richard's leadership convened in the briefing room. Officers filed in, some with open curiosity, others with thinly veiled skepticism. Richard stood at the front, his presence commanding yet unpretentious. Good morning, he began. Thank you all for being here. Today's meeting is about more than policy changes or new protocols. It's about redefining who we are as a department and what we stand for. A hand shot up near the back. It belonged to Officer Turner, a middle-aged man with a weathered face and a reputation for speaking his mind. Chief, with all due respect, some of us feel like you came in swinging without understanding how things work here. Daniels was out of line, sure, but suspending him on day one? Feels like you're trying to make an example out of him. The room murmured in agreement. Richard's expression remained calm. I appreciate your honesty, Officer Turner. Let me be clear, Daniel's suspension wasn't about making an example. It was about accountability. His actions weren't just unprofessional, they were unacceptable. And if we allowed that kind of behavior to go unchecked, it reflects on all of us. But, Richard continued, accountability isn't about punishment alone. It's about growth. This isn't about tearing people down, it's about building something better. And that starts with us. The murmurs subsided, replaced by thoughtful silence. Richard outlined a series of initiatives: mandatory training on implicit bias, community outreach programs, and a revamped internal review process to ensure complaints were taken seriously. The response was mixed. Some officers nodded in agreement, while others crossed their arms, their skepticism etched into their expressions. Later that day, Richard's focus turned to the community. He arranged a meeting with local leaders, pastors, activists, business owners, to discuss the department's strained relationship with the residents of Blue Ridge. The gathering took place in the town's community center, a modest building with peeling paint but a palpable sense of hope within its walls. The room was filled with wary faces. Trust between the police and the community had eroded over years of neglect and mistreatment. Richard stood before them, hands clasped, his tone earnest. I won't stand here and pretend to understand all of your experiences, he began. But I can promise you this: I'm here to listen, to learn, and to work with you. The problems we face won't be solved overnight, but together we can take the first steps. An older woman in the front row raised her hand. Chief Nelson, people around here are tired of promises. We've heard them before. What makes you any different? Richard's gaze met hers. Actions speak louder than words. I'm not asking for your trust today. I'm asking for the opportunity to earn it. The room's tension eased slightly, though skepticism lingered. Over the next hour, Richard fielded questions and concerns, addressing each with transparency and respect. By the end of the meeting, the atmosphere had shifted. It wasn't quite optimism, but it was a start. Back at the precinct, the pushback continued. Officer Daniels, despite his suspension, remained a shadow over the department. He filed an appeal, claiming Richard's actions were excessive and discriminatory. The move emboldened a small faction of officers who saw Daniels as a scapegoat. Whispers of dissent reached Richard's ears, but he remained steadfast. One evening, as Richard reviewed files in his office, Officer Reyes, a younger recruit, knocked hesitantly on his door. Chief? Can I talk to you for a minute? Of course, Richard said, gesturing for her to sit. Reyes looked nervous, twisting her hands in her lap. I wanted to say thank you for what you're trying to do here. A lot of us are scared to speak up, but it means a lot to see someone finally holding people accountable. Richard offered a small smile. Thank you, Reyes. Change isn't easy, and it's not always popular. But it's worth it. If you ever need support, my door is always open. Reyes nodded, her expression softening. I appreciate that, Chief. I just hope more people see it the way I do. The weeks that followed were marked by a delicate balancing act. Richard faced resistance from within and skepticism from without, but he pressed on. Training sessions began, with officers begrudgingly attending but slowly engaging. Community outreach events were organized, drawing tentative but growing participation. Complaints about misconduct were no longer dismissed but investigated thoroughly, sending a clear message that the old ways were no longer acceptable. Still, the challenges were relentless. Daniel's appeal moved forward, forcing Richard to defend his actions before a review board. The proceedings were tense, with Daniel's attorney painting him as a victim of overreach. Richard, however, presented the facts with unflinching clarity, detailing Daniel's history of misconduct and the toxic culture he had perpetuated. The board's decision ultimately upheld Richard's actions, affirming Daniel's suspension. The ruling sent shockwaves through the precinct, solidifying Richard's authority, but also deepening the divide among the officers. For some, it was a turning point. For others, it was a line in the sand. Through it all, Richard remained resolute. He walked the halls daily, engaging with his officers and reminding them of their shared mission. He attended community events, listened to residents, and built bridges where walls once stood. And he never wavered in his belief that change was possible, even when the road was steep. By the end of his first month, the precinct was far from perfect, but it was undeniably different. Small victories, a recruit speaking up, a resident expressing renewed hope, were steps towards something greater. Richard knew the battle was far from over, but he also knew he wasn't fighting it alone. The early morning sunlight filtered through the blinds of Richard Nelson's office as he stared at the report in front of him. It was yet another complaint, this time from a young recruit who had anonymously detailed instances of hazing within the department. The accusations pointed to several senior officers, including a few Richard had already flagged as problematic during his review of personnel files. This report was different, though. It was raw, detailed, and unmistakably authentic. If true, it painted a damning picture of the deeply entrenched toxic culture within the Blue Ridge precinct. Richard leaned back in his chair, his thoughts racing. The momentum he had built over the past month felt fragile, and the department's fractures seemed more glaring with every passing day. His mind churned through the possible fallout. Investigating these claims would undoubtedly trigger a backlash, further polarizing an already tense department. But leaving the accusations unaddressed was not an option. The stakes were growing higher, and the pressure was mounting. The knock on his office door snapped him out of his thoughts. It was Captain Harris, his expression a mix of concern and frustration. "Chief, we've got a situation," Harris said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "What is it?" Richard asked, sitting up. Harris hesitated, his brow furrowed. "It's Daniels. He's stirring up trouble. A few of the officers who were on the fence about your changes are now siding with him. He's accusing you of targeting him unfairly, saying this is all part of some agenda." Richard's jaw tightened. Daniels had already appealed his suspension, unsuccessfully, but his influence lingered. Now, he was leveraging the department's divisions to rally dissent. "What exactly is he saying?" "He's claiming your policies are undermining the department's ability to function," Harris explained. "He's playing up the idea that you're an outsider who doesn't understand how things work here. And," Harris's voice trailed off briefly before continuing, "and he's saying your leadership is dividing the department." Richard exhaled slowly, his gaze fixed on a spot on his desk. "Let him talk," he said finally. "But make it clear to everyone that baseless accusations won't distract from the work we're doing." Harris nodded but looked uneasy. "Chief, with all due respect, Daniels isn't just talking. He's organizing. Some officers are starting to push back against the training sessions, and a few have even called in sick during critical shifts. We've already got staffing issues, and if this continues, it's going to hurt morale." Richard's eyes narrowed. He knew this was a calculated move, a strategy to undermine his authority and derail his reforms. "Thanks for bringing this to me, Harris. I'll address it directly." The captain's hesitation was palpable, but he nodded and left. Alone again, Richard felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Daniels wasn't just a disgruntled officer, he was a rallying point for those resistant to change. This wasn't merely about policy disagreements, it was a battle for the soul of the department. Later that day, Richard called a meeting with his command staff. Around the table sat a mix of supportive and skeptical faces. He wasted no time addressing the growing unrest. "I'm aware that some of you have concerns about the changes we're implementing," he began. "I'm also aware that Officer Daniels has been vocal in his opposition, Let me be clear, constructive criticism is welcome, but sabotage will not be tolerated. Lieutenant Morris, an older officer with decades of experience, cleared his throat. Chief, I don't think anyone here is trying to sabotage you, he said carefully. But the pace of these changes, it's a lot for some folks to handle. Daniels might be going about it the wrong way, but he's not the only one who feels like this department's being upended. Richard's gaze locked onto Morris. The department is being upended, Lieutenant. That's the point. The question is whether we're willing to confront what's broken or if we're content to let it fester. The room fell silent. Richard continued, his voice steady but firm. I'm not here to make friends. I'm here to make this department better. That means holding people accountable and making hard changes. If anyone here has a better solution, I'm all ears. But if not, I expect your support in moving forward. The meeting adjourned without further objections, but the tension in the room was undeniable. Richard knew he had allies among his command staff, but he also knew that fear of change ran deep. The next few weeks brought escalating challenges. A high-profile incident involving excessive force by an officer made headlines, fueling community outrage and further straining relations between the precinct and the public. Richard acted swiftly, launching an internal investigation and placing the officer on administrative leave pending the outcome. His decisiveness earned praise from some quarters but also deepened the rift within the department. Meanwhile, Daniels intensified his efforts to sow discord. He held informal meetings at a local bar, where he painted himself as a martyr for the department's traditional values. Word of these gatherings reached Richard through his more loyal officers, and he knew he couldn't ignore them. One evening, Richard decided to confront Daniels directly. He arrived at the bar unannounced, drawing startled glances from the off-duty officers gathered there. Daniels' smug expression faltered as Richard approached him. Chief, Daniels said, his tone mocking. Didn't expect to see you here. Clearly, Richard replied evenly. Can we talk? Daniels gestured theatrically to the empty stool beside him. By all means. Richard sat, his demeanor calm but resolute. Daniels, I know what you're doing. And I know why you're doing it. You're scared of change, and you think if you dig your heels in long enough, things will go back to the way they were. But that's not going to happen. Daniels smirked. Is that so? Last I checked, Chief, you need people to run a department. And a lot of people here aren't exactly thrilled with your new rules. Richard leaned in slightly, his voice low but firm. I don't need everyone to like me, Daniels. I need them to do their jobs. And I need them to do them right. If you want to be part of that, there's still a place for you. But if you keep undermining this department, you'll find yourself on the outside looking in. Daniel's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. Richard stood, his gaze steady. Think about it. Because the path you're on doesn't end well. Richard left the bar without waiting for a response. The confrontation had been necessary, but it was just one battle in a larger war. As he walked into the crisp night air, he couldn't shake the feeling that the real crisis was still ahead. Change was happening, but it was coming at a cost, one that Richard hoped he was prepared to pay. The precinct's briefing room buzzed with an air of unease as officers gathered, summoned for an emergency meeting by Chief Richard Nelson. The past few weeks had been marked by growing tensions, with factions forming among the ranks. Richard stood at the podium, his eyes scanning the room as the chatter died down. Every seat was filled, including those of officers who had been notably absent from previous meetings. Even Daniels, his expression a mix of defiance and apprehension, sat near the back. Good evening, Richard began, his voice steady. I called this meeting because the issues we face as a department have reached a critical point. It's time we address them head-on. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the overhead lights. This department is at a crossroads, he continued. We can either cling to a broken system that serves no one but ourselves, or we can embrace the hard work of change. The choice is ours, but let me be clear, the status quo is no longer an option. Richard's gaze fell on Daniels. Officer Daniels, you've been vocal in your opposition to the changes we're implementing. You've held meetings, spread misinformation, and undermined this department at every turn. I've tolerated it because I believe in giving people the chance to rise to the occasion. But that ends now." Daniels shifted in his seat, his bravado faltering. "With all due respect, Chief," he began, his voice tinged with sarcasm, "this isn't about change. It's about you pushing your agenda and alienating the people who keep this department running." A murmur rippled through the room, but Richard held up a hand to silence it. "You're right about one thing, Daniels. This is about change. But it's not my agenda. It's about creating a department that earns the trust of the community we serve. It's about ensuring that every officer here upholds the values of integrity, respect, and accountability." Richard stepped away from the podium, his voice rising slightly. "This isn't just about Daniels. It's about all of us. Every single person in this room has a choice to make. Are you part of the problem, or are you part of the solution? Because I promise you, there is no middle ground." The tension in the room was palpable. Richard's eyes swept the crowd, locking with each officer's gaze. "Effective immediately," Richard announced. "Officer Daniels is relieved of his duties pending termination. His actions have undermined this department's mission and compromised its integrity. There will be no tolerance for behavior that divides us or dishonors the badge." Gasps and murmurs erupted, but Richard's voice cut through the noise. "This decision was not made lightly, but it is necessary. For those of you who feel the same way Daniels does, consider this your wake-up call. The days of looking the other way are over." Daniels stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is a mistake," he spat, his face red with anger. "You're tearing this department apart." "No, Daniels," Richard replied, his tone calm but firm. "I'm putting it back together. And it starts with accountability." As Daniels stormed out of the room, the tension hung heavy. Richard returned to the podium, his voice softening but retaining its edge. "This is not about punishment," he said. "It's about setting a standard. I know change is hard. I know it's uncomfortable. But it's also necessary. And I believe that together, we can build a department that we're all proud to be a part of." Richard stepped back, allowing the silence to speak louder than any words could. One by one, officers began to nod. It wasn't unanimous, but it was a start. The divide in the room was still visible, but so was the potential for unity. As the meeting concluded, Richard remained behind, watching as officers filed out. A few stopped to shake his hand, their gestures tentative but genuine. It wasn't victory, but it was progress. And for Richard, that was enough to keep fighting. In the days following the climactic meeting, a sense of cautious optimism began to permeate the Blue Ridge precinct. The removal of Officer Daniels sent a clear message that accountability was not a hollow promise but a guiding principle under Chief Richard Nelson's leadership. While some officers still grumbled in private, the tide was beginning to shift. Richard made it a point to walk the halls daily, engaging with officers and staff on a personal level. His presence served as both a reminder of his expectations and an invitation for dialogue. Officers who had once been skeptical found themselves opening up to the idea of a department built on mutual respect and shared responsibility. One such officer was Reyes, the young recruit who had privately expressed her gratitude to Richard weeks earlier. She approached him during a quiet moment in the precinct's lounge. "Chief," she said, her voice steady but earnest, "I just wanted to say thank you again. It's not easy, what you're doing, but it's making a difference." Richard smiled, his eyes reflecting both gratitude and determination. "Thank you, Reyes. Change isn't easy, but it's worth it. And it starts with officers like you, willing to do the hard work." The community, too, began to notice the difference. Richard's efforts to rebuild trust extended beyond the precinct's walls. He attended town hall meetings, listened to residents' concerns, and worked with local leaders to implement programs that fostered positive interactions between officers and the community. Slowly but surely, bridges were being rebuilt. At one such event, a young boy approached Richard, his wide eyes filled with curiosity. "Are you the chief of police?" the boy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Richard crouched down to meet his gaze. "I am," he said with a warm smile. "And I'm here to make sure you and everyone else in this town feels safe and respected." The boy's face lit up. "My dad says the police are different now. He says you're trying to fix things?" Richard's smile deepened. "Your dad's right. We are. And it's a team effort. You help us by being the future we're working toward." By the end of his first 6 months, the precinct was far from perfect, but the changes were undeniable. Officers who couldn't adapt to the new standards had moved on, replaced by recruits who embraced the vision of a fair and accountable department. The community, once wary, was beginning to see signs of progress. Late one evening, Richard sat alone in his office, reflecting on his journey. The challenges had been immense, and the road ahead was still uncertain. But as he glanced at the small token the young boy had given him, a hand-drawn picture of a badge with the words, "Thank you," scrawled beneath it, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight for change was far from over, but Richard knew one thing for certain: it was a fight worth waging. If this story of justice and resilience inspired you, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Stay with us for more powerful tales of leadership and change. You won't want to miss the next chapter in our journey to uncover truth and transformation. What would you have done in Chief Nelson's position? Share your thoughts in the comments below and join the conversation. Let's talk about the challenges of leading change and how we can all make a difference. Did you notice all the moments that led to the turning point in this story? Tell us your favorite scene or the lesson that stuck with you most. Like, share, and let's spread the message of accountability and hope together.